Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Richard Backus, publisher of University Teaching Edition, and each day I invite you to join me as we reflect on a significant moment from our shared past. Today is November 15th, and we're looking back 248 years to November 15th, 1777. On that day, in the midst of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress meeting in York, Pennsylvania, adopted America's first Constitution. The document was called the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. It created a formal alliance among the 13 states and established the framework for a national government. The Articles represented a bold experiment in self-governance, an attempt by 13 former colonies to unite as independent states while preserving their individual sovereignty. For 13 years, from 1781 to 1789, the Articles served as America's governing document. But the experiment ultimately failed. The government created by the Articles was too weak, too decentralized, and too hamstrung by requirements for unanimous consent to function effectively. Its failures would lead directly to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the creation of the U.S. Constitution we live under today. The story of the Articles of Confederation is a story about learning from failure, about the difficult balance between unity and independence, and about how America's founders had to reconsider and revise their ideas about what kind of government they needed. Understanding why the Articles failed helps us appreciate why the Constitution was structured the way it was, and why debates about federal versus state power continue to this day. To understand the Articles of Confederation, we need to understand the circumstances in which they were created. In the summer of 1776, the Continental Congress had declared independence from Britain, but declaring independence and actually governing as an independent nation were two different things. The 13 former colonies needed to create a formal government structure. This was uncharted territory. The colonies had just fought a war and were still fighting to escape what they saw as tyrannical central authority from Britain. They were deeply suspicious of strong central government, standing armies, and concentrated power. Many Americans identified primarily with their individual states rather than with America as a whole. A Virginian saw himself as a Virginian first, an American second. Yet they also recognized that some form of union was necessary. Fighting the Revolutionary War required coordinated military action, diplomacy with foreign powers, and management of shared concerns like currency and trade. Individual states couldn't effectively conduct war or foreign relations on their own. They needed a central government, but one that wouldn't replicate British tyranny. The challenge was creating a government strong enough to function, but not so strong that it threatened the liberty they were fighting to secure. In June 1776, even before independence was declared, Congress appointed a committee to draft a plan for Confederation. The committee was chaired by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who produced the initial draft. But turning that draft into an adopted document took time. Congress debated the Articles through 1776 and 1777, while simultaneously fighting a war, managing military logistics, and conducting diplomacy. Different states had different interests and concerns. Large states wanted representation based on population. Small states wanted equal representation. States with Western land claims wanted those recognized. States without such claims wanted Western lands shared. Southern states wanted enslaved people not counted for tax purposes. Northern states disagreed. These debates delayed adoption. Finally, on November 15, 1777, Congress approved the Articles and sent them to the states for ratification. But the ratification process took even longer. The Articles required unanimous consent from all 13 states, and various disputes, particularly over Western land claims, prevented quick agreement. Maryland, the last holdout, didn't ratify until March 1st, 1781. So while the Articles were adopted in 1777, they didn't become operational until 1781, nearly 5 years after independence was declared. The government created by the Articles of Confederation was radically different from the government we have today. The Articles created a confederation, a loose alliance of sovereign states, rather than a true national government. Each state retained its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. The central government had extremely limited powers. There was no president or executive branch. There was no federal court system. The only institution of central government was Congress, where each state had one vote regardless of size. Major decisions required approval from 9 of the 13 states. Any amendment to the Articles required unanimous consent from all 13. Congress's powers were limited to specific areas: conducting foreign relations, declaring war and peace, maintaining an army and navy, regulating coinage, establishing post offices, and managing relations with Native American tribes. Notably absent were crucial powers. Congress could not tax citizens directly, could not regulate commerce between states, and could not enforce its own laws. This last limitation was fatal. Congress could pass laws and make decisions, but it had no mechanism to enforce them. If a state ignored Congress's requests or refused to comply with its decisions, Congress had no recourse. The central government had to rely on states voluntarily doing what Congress asked. Financially, this system was catastrophic. Congress could request money from states, but states could refuse or simply not pay. Congress had no power to tax citizens directly to raise revenue. This meant the national government was perpetually broke. During the Revolutionary War, this weakness was somewhat masked because the war emergency motivated states to contribute. But after the war ended in 1783, state cooperation declined sharply. The Articles reflected the founders' deep fear of centralized power. They had just fought a revolution against what they saw as tyrannical authority from London. They were determined not to replace British tyranny with American tyranny. Better, they believed, to err on the side of too little central power than too much. But they discovered that too little power created its own serious problems. The years from 1783 to 1787, after the Revolutionary War ended, but before the Constitution was adopted, are sometimes called the critical period of American history. During these years, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation became painfully apparent. First, there was the financial crisis. Congress had accumulated massive debts during the Revolutionary War. Debts to foreign governments, to American citizens who had loaned money or supplied goods, and to soldiers who hadn't been paid. Congress couldn't tax to raise revenue, and states increasingly ignored requests for money. The national government teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Foreign creditors questioned whether America could pay its debts. This damaged American credit and international reputation. Second, there were interstate disputes. Without federal authority to regulate commerce, states imposed tariffs on each other's goods. New York taxed goods from New Jersey and Connecticut. States competed rather than cooperated economically. Some states printed their own paper money, creating currency chaos. Without a federal court system, there was no neutral arbiter for disputes between states. Third, there was international weakness. Foreign powers, particularly Britain, didn't take the American government seriously. Britain refused to evacuate military posts in the Northwest Territory as required by the peace treaty, calculating that Congress couldn't force them out. Spain closed the Mississippi River to American navigation. Pirates from North African states captured American ships and enslaved their crews, knowing America lacked the military power to respond effectively. The United States was seen internationally as a weak confederation unlikely to survive. Fourth, there were domestic disturbances. In 1786, economic depression and heavy state taxation sparked Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, an armed uprising of indebted farmers who closed courts to prevent foreclosures. The rebellion was eventually put down by state militia, but it terrified American leaders. If states faced rebellion and the national government couldn't help maintain order, what did that say about the viability of the Confederation? These problems convinced many American leaders that the Articles were inadequate. The Confederation was failing. Something had to change, or the United States might fracture into separate nations or collapse into chaos. In May 1787, delegates from 12 states gathered together. Rhode Island refused to participate, in Philadelphia ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation. But once assembled, they made a fateful decision. Rather than trying to fix the Articles, they would write an entirely new constitution, creating a fundamentally different government. This was legally questionable. They had been authorized only to propose amendments to the Articles, which required unanimous state consent. Instead, they were creating a new government and proposing that it be adopted if 9 states ratified it, bypassing the Article's requirement for unanimity. It was, in a sense, a peaceful revolution, replacing one system of government with another through debate and persuasion rather than force. The Constitution they created was radically different from the Articles. It established a true national government with 3 branches, a legislative branch with 2 houses, one representing states equally, one representing population, an executive branch headed by a president, and a judicial branch with federal courts. This national government had powers the Articles lacked. It could tax directly, regulate interstate and foreign commerce, raise armies, and enforce its own laws. Crucially, the Constitution made federal law supreme over state law. While states retained significant powers, federalism, they were no longer sovereign entities in a loose confederation. They were parts of a unified nation with a real national government. The Constitution also included mechanisms the Articles lacked. The president could enforce laws, federal courts could resolve disputes, and amendments required only 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of states, rather than unanimity. The government could actually function and adapt. The debates over ratifying the Constitution were intense. Federalists argued that stronger national government was necessary for survival. Anti-Federalists warned against concentrated power and feared the new Constitution would destroy state sovereignty and individual liberty. The debate produced the Federalist Papers, some of the most sophisticated political philosophy in American history, as well as passionate arguments on both sides. Ultimately, the Constitution was ratified. The new government began operating in 1789. The Articles of Confederation were history, a failed experiment in extreme decentralization. The failure of the Articles of Confederation teaches us several important lessons about government and political organization. First, it demonstrates that too little government can be as problematic as too much. The founders' initial impulse to create a very weak central government to protect liberty proved unworkable. Some degree of central authority with power to tax, regulate, and enforce laws is necessary for a government to function. The challenge is finding the right balance. Second, the articles illustrate the importance of enforcement mechanisms. A government that can make decisions but can't enforce them isn't really governing, it's requesting. The Articles Congress could pass resolutions, but if states ignored them, nothing happened. The Constitution gave the federal government tools to enforce its laws, a president to execute them, courts to adjudicate them, and the power to compel obedience. Third, the failure of unanimity requirements demonstrates why supermajority rules can paralyze government. Requiring all 13 states to agree before amending the Articles made reform impossible. One state could block necessary changes, no matter how many other states supported them. The Constitution's amendment process is still difficult, requiring 2/3 and 3/4 supermajorities, but it's not impossible. Fourth, the transition from Articles to Constitution shows that political systems can change peacefully through deliberation and persuasion. The founders could have tried to make the Articles work indefinitely, or they could have resorted to force. Instead, they argued, debated, compromised, and created something better. This peaceful transition became a model for legitimate constitutional change. Fifth, the Articles remind us that federalism, the division of powers between national and state governments, has always been contested in America. The founders couldn't agree in the 1770s on the right balance between central authority and state sovereignty. They still couldn't fully agree in 1787. And we still debate these questions today. The debates that shaped the Articles and the Constitution remain relevant in contemporary politics. We still argue about federal versus state power, about whether the national government is too strong or too weak, about which level of government should handle which responsibilities. When states challenge federal laws or regulations, claiming they exceed federal authority, they're echoing anti-federalist arguments from the 1780s. When the federal government asserts authority over matters states claim as their own, education, health care, police powers, we're revisiting the debates that led to the Constitution. The fundamental tension between national unity and local autonomy hasn't been permanently resolved. Each generation wrestles with it anew. The Articles also remind us about the importance of effective government. Modern anti-government rhetoric sometimes suggests that the best government is the least government. The Articles represent the logical extreme of that position, a government so weak it could barely function. The experience taught the founders that while government power can be abused, government weakness has its own serious consequences. The question isn't whether to have effective government, but how to structure it to be both effective and accountable. The unanimous consent requirement in the Articles finds echoes in modern international organizations like the United Nations Security Council, where any permanent member can veto action. The Articles demonstrate the paralysis this can cause. When one actor can block collective action, the collective can't respond effectively to challenges. This remains a central problem in international cooperation. The financial problems under the Articles, a government without revenue, unable to pay debts or provide services, resonate in modern debates about taxation and government spending. A government that can't raise revenue can't function. But the power to tax is also the power to oppress. Finding the right balance between adequate revenue and limited taxation was a central challenge in 1787 and remains one today. Despite their ultimate failure, the Articles of Confederation did accomplish important things. They held the states together during and immediately after the Revolutionary War. They provided a framework, however imperfect, for collective action. They negotiated the Treaty of Paris ending the war. They established the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which provided a framework for adding new states, a framework that would help America expand across the continent. Perhaps most importantly, the Articles' failure taught American leaders what kind of government they needed. The Constitution wasn't created in the abstract. It was created in response to specific problems that had emerged under the Articles. The founders knew what didn't work and could design something better. In this sense, the Articles were a necessary step toward creating a workable constitutional system. The Articles also demonstrated that failure isn't fatal if you learn from it. The founders could have stubbornly clung to their original plan or could have given up on union entirely. Instead, they acknowledged the system wasn't working and were willing to try something fundamentally different. This flexibility and willingness to learn from experience was itself an achievement. On November 15, 1777, the Continental Congress adopted America's first Constitution. It was inadequate to the task. Within a decade, it would be replaced. But those 13 years under the Articles weren't wasted. They taught American leaders crucial lessons about government structure, about the balance between unity and independence, and about the need for enforcement mechanisms and adequate powers. The Constitution we have today exists because the Articles failed. The specific powers granted to Congress, the creation of a strong presidency, the establishment of federal courts, the supremacy of federal law, all these features were responses to problems that emerged under the Articles. The founders learned from experience and built something better. That willingness to learn and adapt, to acknowledge failure and try again, may be the Articles' most important legacy. Perfect government wasn't created on the first try. It required experimentation, failure, learning, and revision. In a sense, it still does. The great philosopher George Santayana once wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The Articles of Confederation teach us that too little government can be as problematic as too much, that enforcement mechanisms matter, and that political systems sometimes need fundamental restructuring. Understanding this early failure helps us appreciate the Constitution's design and reminds us that learning from mistakes is essential to creating effective government. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Richard Backus, and I'll be back tomorrow with another story from our shared past.